stays cool for a long time after the sun goes down. The walls are thick and the roof is low, and the floor is bare earth. A doorway lets in one band of light, and the light does not reach the corners. The rest of the room stays dim all day and dark all night. Big clay jars stand along one wall, and the tallest come up to a person's shoulder. They are wide at the mouth and narrow towards the foot, and the clay is rough and gray with dust. Inside them is grain, saved from the harvest and meant to last the winter. The smell of it is dry and a little sweet, and it fills the whole room. Nothing moves in here for hours at a time, and the room makes almost no sound. The grain settles a little as the days go by, too quietly for anyone to hear. Outside, the village is a scatter of rooms, much like this one, all low and square. The fields start where the last house ends, and the ground between them is packed hard. Rooms like this were built all over the warm, dry parts of the world. They were built to keep grain away from wet weather and away from animals. People made them a little better as the centuries went by, and the reason never changed. Grain brings mice, and mice bring the small animals that eat mice, and the room sits in the middle. What follows is the long story of the small cat that came to rooms like this and stayed. The story keeps to bones because very little of this was ever written down. It runs from the first grain stores to a kitchen floor with the heating on underneath it. In the early morning, the light in the doorway turns from gray to a pale yellow. It moves slowly across the floor as the sun climbs, and it takes most of the morning to cross. By the middle of the day, it is narrowed to a bright line near the threshold. After that, it swings back the other way, and by evening it is gray again. At night, the room is colder than the air outside it, and the cold comes up out of the floor. The grain gives off a faint warmth of its own for a few weeks after harvest and then stops. Mice come in along the base of the wall where the brick meets the earth in single file, without hurrying. They go up the side of a jar by the rough places in the clay, and they come down the same way with their cheeks full. Down at the far end of the room, behind the last jar, there is a gap between the wall and the floor. It is the width of 2 fingers, and it runs back into the dark under the brick. Something has worn the edges of it smooth, going in and out, night after night, for a long time. Out beyond the fields, the ground turns to scrub, and the scrub goes on for a great distance. There are thorn bushes and dry grass and stones, and low places where water sits after rain. In the heat of the afternoon, nothing much stirs out there, and the air over the stones shakes. Under one of the bushes, a cat is lying on her side in the shade. She is small and sandy brown, with narrow, dark stripes down her flanks and rings on her tail. Her legs are long for her size, and her body is thin, and her ears are set wide on her head. She has been asleep since the middle of the morning, and she has barely moved. When the light goes orange, she opens her eyes and lies there a while longer. Then she stands and stretches out one back leg and then the other and shakes herself. She walks out of the shade and along the edge of the bushes, keeping to the low ground. This is her country, and she knows every stone in it, and she does not share it with another cat. She stops at a patch of dry grass and sits down and does nothing at all. Her ears turn forward, then one turns sideways on its own, then it turns back. Somewhere under the grass there is a mouse moving, and the sound it makes is thin and high. She waits. The waiting goes on far longer than seems reasonable, and she does not shift her weight. Then she's across the grass in 3 strides, and it is over. She eats where she caught it, quickly, with her ears still turning, and then she cleans her face. After that, she sits again for a while, and then she moves on to the next patch. She will do this all night, and she will cover a good deal of ground. Before it gets light, she will find a hole or a thick bush and go to sleep in it. She takes almost all the water she needs out of what she catches, and she can go a long time without drinking. In the morning, the ground she crossed will show nothing at all, and she will be asleep somewhere out of the sun. Far to the east, on a plain in the middle of China, there was a village that grew millet. The houses had floors dug down, below ground level, and roofs of thatch laid over timber. Millet is a small, hard grain, and it grows well where the summers are hot and short. The people there had been growing it a long while, and they were good at it. Grain has to be kept, or a good harvest is worth no more than a poor one. The village dug pits for it and made pottery for it, tall and awkward for anything to climb. The mice came anyway. They tunneled in from the side, through the wall of a pit, and came up underneath the grain. Where there were mice in that number, there were small cats, and the cats came in and stayed. They were around often enough to leave their bones in the rubbish with everything else. Those bones lay in the ground for 5,000 years, and then lay in a drawer a while longer. When somebody looked at them properly, they still held a record of what the animals had eaten. The people of that village had lived on millet, and so had their pigs and their dogs. The mice had lived on it too. The cats had eaten none of it, and everything the cats had eaten was full of it. One of them had lived long enough to wear its teeth flat, which is a great age for a hunter out in the open. Another had been eating less meat and more grain than the rest, the way an animal does when somebody is leaving food out. If you have this on to fall asleep, that is what it was made for. Subscribing takes a moment, and it keeps the next of these coming to you without effort. If you write below the place you are listening from and the local hour is plenty. Somewhere in Lisbon it is first light, with rain coming in off the water. Somewhere in Nairobi it is the middle of a warm and windless afternoon. Somewhere in Vancouver it is 2 in the morning, and the street outside is empty. The same thing was happening elsewhere, around other stores of grain, in other warm, dry places. Wherever people stopped moving and kept more food than they could eat in a season, the mice came, and the cats came after the mice. Picture the edge of one of those villages after dark. The houses stop, and the fields begin, and past the fields, the scrub goes off into the night. There is a smell of smoke, and animals, and cooking, and there is a heap of scraps behind the last house. Somebody is still awake in one of the rooms, and a dog barks twice and then stops. A cat comes up to the edge of that and sits down in the dark and comes no closer. She is a wild animal, and she has every reason to stay where she is. The people are loud, and there are dogs, and there is fire, and none of it is anything she knows. What she does know is that mice are food, and there are more mice here than out in the scrub. She works the edge all that season and never goes in. Her kittens are born under a thorn bush a little way out and grow up hearing the village every night. To them, the noise is not a warning, because nothing has ever come of it. One of them, grown, hunts the heap behind the last house and sleeps in the daytime under the wall. It went like that, over and over, for a very long time. Nobody caught anything, and nobody tamed anything, and nobody decided anything at all. The cats that could bear the noise ate better, and cats that eat better have more kittens. It ran on its own for centuries, with nobody involved noticing that it was running. There is no first cat in this, and no first family, and no day on which it changed. There is only a slope, and it is a shallow one, and the animal walks down it very slowly. Cyprus sits a long way out from the coast, far enough that nothing walks there on its own. The water between the island and the mainland is deep and open, and it always has been. Every land animal on the island came over in a boat, and somebody put it in that boat on purpose. Pigs went over, and goats, and deer, and cattle, one boatload at a time across the early farming centuries. An animal in the bottom of a small boat is frightened and heavy, and takes up room that could hold food. People did it anyway, again and again, until the island had a full set of animals that had never lived there. Somewhere in among the goats and the deer, a small striped cat went across as well. Nobody wrote down why, and there is nothing a cat does that helps a boat or feeds a family. It went across the open water in the bottom of a boat because somebody wanted it on the other side. There was a village inland from the southern coast of that island, and people lived in it for a long time. They kept animals and grew crops and built with mud and timber, and when a building fell in, they built again on the same spot. The village stood on high ground with the sea a long way off below it, and there were wells cut down through the rock. People had been there for generations, and the ground under the houses was thick with everything they had thrown away. Bones of goats and deer and pigs came out of it in quantity, and among them, here and there, the bones of cats. One grave was cut down into the remains of an old mud building there. A person was laid in it, wrapped or bagged, settled into a half-sitting position and facing west. The arms were folded in against the chest, and the legs were drawn up close. Around them, somebody placed a seashell, a stone pendant, a pair of small polished axes, and worked flint. A short way off, no further than an arm's length, lay a cat. It was whole, with its bones still in order, at the same depth and in the same soil. Nothing had chewed it and nothing had cut it. It was young, about 8 months old, hardly past the size of a kitten. The grave was filled in and covered over, and it stayed covered for 9,500 years. When it was opened again, the man who lifted the cat out of it, bone by bone, was Jean de Vigne. He had been working through the animal bones from that village for years. A jaw here and a leg bone there. Nothing had ever come up whole before, and nothing had ever come up beside a person. For a long while afterwards, that grave was the picture everybody carried of how this began. A person and a cat put into the ground together at the very start of farming. It is a good picture, and it stood at the front of the subject for a long time. Back on the Millet plain, the cats in those villages were not this cat at all. They were a spotted animal of the Asian forests, about the same size, with a shorter face and a heavier jaw. They came in for the mice the same way, and they stayed for as long, and they left the same bones. They are no relation to anything asleep on a bed tonight. The mistake sat in the record for years before anyone caught it. When it was caught by the same man who had lifted the cat out of the grave on the island. He laid 5 old jaws from Chinese villages on a table and compared their their shape against jaws of cats living now. They belonged to the spotted animal, every one of them, and he said so in print. The village was still real, and the mice were still real, and the whole arrangement was still real. It had simply been made by a different animal on its own for the same plain reason. The same thing had happened twice over, in places far apart, out of species, with nothing to do with each other, which leaves one loose end trailing, and it is the spotted cat. An animal that has found its way into villages and settled on the mice does not usually walk away again. It went on living in those villages long after the Millet plain, and then it did walk away. The reason it walked away took a long while to come out, and it had nothing to do with any other cat. A house on the lower Nile has a flat roof and thick walls and small high windows. It stands in the green strip along the river, with desert a short walk away on either side. Inside it is dim and cool, and the floor is swept, and there are jars of grain and oil against the wall. The noise of the street comes in through the door and stops halfway across the room. There is a cat under one of the chairs. She lies with her front paws tucked under her and her tail curled round, watching the doorway. When somebody comes in, she does not get up, and when the food is put down, she goes over without hurrying. She has narrow stripes down her sides, the same stripes as the animal out in the scrub. Somebody painted that scene onto a tomb wall more than once in more than one house. There she is under the chair, eating a fish, with the stripes drawn carefully along her flank. She turns up out in the marshes on hunting trips and on small carved things that people kept at home. The stripes are there in every one of those pictures, on every wall, for hundreds and hundreds of years. The cat from that grave has never given up anything else. The bones are old and the island is warm, and whatever was in them broke down past reading long ago. It says what it said on the day it came up, and nothing more than that. An animal was put in the ground beside a person, whole, on an island where no cat had ever walked. What has changed is the ground on either side of it. Nothing with that animal's ancestry turns up in Europe or in Anatolia for thousands of years afterwards. The cats living near people there through all those centuries were the local wild ones. A cat can be carried across the sea and buried beside somebody and still leave no line behind it. Not everyone has settled on that. The bones have been sampled thinly in the places that matter most, and thin sampling can move a date. There are pictures from Greece and from Italy that show cats earlier than the bones allow for. A picture can show a rare animal, or a borrowed one, or one copied from an older picture. It also cannot be dated the way a bone in the ground can be dated, and so the two sit apart. Above the old Capitol, the desert comes to an edge, and along that edge there is a cliff. The rock is soft enough to cut, and people had been cutting tombs into it for generations. A walled ground was laid out at the foot of it for a goddess who was shown with a cat's head. The old tombs behind the wall were opened up and put to another use entirely. She had temples in more than one town along the river, and the one down in the delta drew crowds. A person walking up to the wall below the cliff came with something to ask for. What they carried in with them and left behind was a cat. On a festival day, the road up to the wall is full from early morning. People come in from the villages and from the river towns, walking in family groups, carrying what they have brought. There are stalls along the way selling food and drink and small bronze figures, and the noise carries a good distance in the dry air. At the wall, the line moves slowly all morning, and everybody standing in it is holding something wrapped. The animals were bred for that, and brought in from outside in quantity, and their lives were short. It is the plain fact of the place, and it sits there under everything else. What happened after that was careful work, done by people who had done it a great many times before. There is a salt that gathers white and crumbling in dried lake beds out in the desert. A body was laid down in it and covered over and left until the moisture had gone out of it. What came out at the end of that was light and stiff and held its shape. It was packed then to fill out the hollows with rolled linen or with sand or straw. The packing went in a little at a time until the shape was firm and even. Resin came next, warmed until it ran, brushed or poured over the outside. It went on dark and slow and smelled faintly sweet, and it set hard as it cooled. And the wrapping began in narrow strips of linen wound round and round the body. The strips were pulled tight enough to hold and no tighter, and the winding took a while. Light cloth and dark cloth were crossed over each other to make diamonds and bands down the length. Somebody good at it could lay a pattern that ran true from one end to the other. The finished bundle was long and narrow, with a rounded top, made to stand upright rather than lie flat. The face went on last. A pair of small ears was shaped from cloth and fixed to the top of it. Eyes and a nose and a mouth were painted onto the wrapping in black and in ochre. Some bundles were given a bronze mask over the front, and some were set inside a small wooden box. Most were given neither of those and went in as they were. Then the bundle was carried in through the wall and along the passages cut back into the cliff. The passages are dark and dry and cool, and the marks of the tools that cut them are still on the walls. The bundles were set down in rows and in stacks, and the rows went back further every year. They went on, being set down there, through one ruling house after another. The old gods gave way to Greek rulers and then to Roman ones, and the passages kept filling. When it stopped at last, there were more bundles in the rock than anyone had thought to count. They lay there in the dark for the better part of 2,000 years. The cliff above them held the desert off, and the air inside stayed dry enough to keep linen and bone and paint. Then, late in the 1800s, somebody worked out that they could be sold. The place they came out of was a cliff cemetery well up the river from the old capital. It was emptied in a hurry by the cartload and taken down to the coast. Some went to farmers along the way, and the rest was loaded onto steamers bound for England. The cargo came in at Liverpool in the winter of 1890. It was many tons of wrapped cats, reckoned at the time at 180,000 animals. It was sold at auction in a sale room in the town by the ton, to be spread on fields as fertilizer. A handful of bundles were kept back from the sale and handed to the museum there, and those are still in it. Everything else went out onto farmland in the northwest of England and into the soil. It went out as a fertilizer, spread by the cartload over fields of wheat and turnips in an ordinary English spring. An Egyptologist named Gaston Maspero wrote against it that same year. The animals were themselves a record, he said, of what had been living in the valley and when. Nobody stopped the trade because of it, and it took about a century for his point to become the ordinary view The cats in those bundles were house cats, and they had always looked like house cats. Where the house cat itself first came from took a great deal longer to work out. The answer turned out to be the dry country along the north of Africa, not the Levant, and not Europe, and not further east. Somewhere along that northern edge, out of animals living around towns and farms, the tame cat was made. It stayed close to home for a long time after that. In Europe and in Anatolia, the cats living near people through all those early centuries were the local wild ones, a bigger and heavier animal. The house cat is not in the ground there at all, and then it is in a great deal of it. Wild cats were carried out to Sardinia early, put ashore, and left, and they went wild again on the island. Their descendants are still there. The house cat itself came later, at about 2,000 years ago, and once it started moving, it did not stop. A harbor town on the African coast, in summer smells of fish and tar and hot stone. There are ships along the quay taking on grain and oil and hides, and the loading goes on most of the day. The sacks come down from the carts and go up the plank on men's shoulders, and the dust of the grain hangs in the air. Cats live on a quay like that in numbers, because a quay is a long, thin heap of spilled food. They are under the carts and behind the barrels and up in the rafters of the sheds. A ship taking on grain is taking on mice at the same time, whether anyone means to or not. Sooner or later, a cat goes up the plank along with the sacks, and the ship casts off and sails. A frontier fort in the north in December is a cold, muddy, crowded place. There's a wall and a ditch, and inside it, timber barracks with narrow rooms and low doors. There are workshops and ovens and a yard where the carts are unloaded, and smoke over all of it from morning to night. The most guarded building in the place is the granary. It stands up off the ground on short stone pillars so that air moves underneath and the floor stays dry. The walls are thick and buttressed, and there are narrow vents instead of windows. Inside are the grain and the beans and the salt meat for a garrison through a winter. At night, that building is the quietest one inside the walls and the busiest one underneath. The grain shifts a little as it settles, and the mice work along the joints where the boards meet the stone. A cat with the run of a place like that is hunting under a roof, out of the rain, in the dark. The food does not run out, and the hunting ground does not change from one month to the next. The roads ran from one end of the empire to the other and were kept in repair the whole way. Carts went along them, loaded with everything a garrison eats, and the carts stopped every night. An animal that lives around people can cross a continent on a system like that in a few generations. They reached the northern islands within the 1st century, and after that, they were in every province of it. Out on the water, the ship rolls slowly, and the timbers work against each other all night. The hold is black and close, and smells of grain and bilge and wet rope. Down among the sacks, something moves that is not the ship moving, and then stops, and then moves again. The cat that came up the plank has the run of the whole of it. There is nowhere for anything to go, and no season, and no weather, and the hunting never stops. She is fed by the crew as well, because a crew with time on its hands will feed a cat. The ship puts in at an island and unloads, and some of the cats go ashore and stay. It does this at the next island and the one after that for years, and so does every other ship. Islands that had no cat at all have cats within a generation or two, and nobody anywhere intended it. A halt on the eastern road is a walled yard with rooms round the edge and a well in the middle. Camels are couched along one side, and the loads are stacked under the arcade, out of the weather. There is straw everywhere, and grain for the animals, and sacks of things going east and west. Nobody stays long in a place like that. The carts and the strings of camels come in at dusk and go out again after dawn, and the yard is empty by mid-morning. What stays behind is the grain in the store, and the mice in the grain, and the cats that live on the mice. A cat can go a long way on a road like that without ever meaning to travel. It gets into a load or follows a cart to the next halt and stays there, or is carried on by somebody who likes it. The road runs on for thousands of miles, halt after halt, and every halt has a grain store in it. Far out on flat land, near an inland sea, there was a town built of brick. The country around it is level in every direction, with reeds along the old river channels, and dry grass everywhere else. The wind comes across it, with nothing to slow it down, and the winters are long. The people of that country were herders and moved with their animals through the year. The town was the settled place among them, where the roads met and the goods were stacked. One road ran south towards the old cities, and another ran north towards the river country. A cat lived in that town, a male, and he had a hard life of it. He broke bones more than once, in more than one place, and every break knitted and left the bone thickened where it healed. A small cat that cannot hunt does not usually last the season. He lasted, and then he lasted again, and he went on lasting for years. Towards the end, he had almost no teeth left in his head. A cat in that state cannot take a mouse, and cannot tear anything, and cannot manage a bone. What was in his own bones by then was a diet with more meat in it than the dogs of that town were getting. Somebody was putting food down for him, day after day, in a place where a cat guards nothing and carries nothing. That was around the 9th century, out on the flat land, among people who kept sheep and horses. A herding people has little use for an animal that guards no flock and carries no load. He caught nothing at all by the end, and he was fed anyway through the winters until he died of being old. When he was put in the ground, he went in whole, and he came up whole a very long time afterwards. The bones went onto a table in front of a woman named Ashley Haruta, and she read them through one at a time. A ship at sea is a wooden box full of food, and the box is shut. Below the deck, there are barrels of water and salt meat, jars of oil, sacks of flour, and hard biscuit. There is ballast stone in the very bottom, and coils of rope, and spare timber, and chests of tools. There are the men's own boxes, and there is dust and damp and no light at all. Rats come aboard on the ropes in Harbour, and then they do not leave. A rat below deck has food and warmth and darkness, and nothing hunting it, and it breeds accordingly. A crew that loses its stores in the middle of an ocean has lost a good deal more than its stores. In the summer of 1559, a fleet crossed the Atlantic and anchored in a wide, shallow bay. The plan was to hold that coast and settle it, and the settling started at once. A storm came through not long afterwards and put several of the ships down where they lay. They stayed on the bottom, under the sand, for a very long time. When one of them was opened up again, there were cats down among the barrels. One was full grown and one was young, and they are the oldest cats yet found anywhere in that country. What they had been eating showed up in their bones, and it was fish and meat off the ship's own stores. Fish is not what an animal living on rats in a hold ends up with. A cat eating ship's food at sea is eating what the crew is eating, out of a ration that was counted and weighed. Somebody was handing it over every day of the crossing, a very long way from anywhere at all. Back east on the Millet plain, the spotted cats went on living around the villages for a very long time. They are there through the late Stone Age and through the Bronze Years and on into the First Empires. The last of them turns up at about the 2nd century, and after that they stop. Nothing at all comes in behind them. For close to 600 years, there are no small cat bones in those villages of any kind. The gap sits over a bad stretch of history when the empire came apart and stayed apart. The weather turned colder and drier. The harvest came in short, and the country lost people for generations. A cat that lives on the mice of a grain store needs there to be grain stores. When the villages thin out and the surplus goes, the mice go first, and the cats go after them. The spotted cat lost no fight and was pushed out by nothing better. It seems to have gone back to the woods when the thing it lived on stopped being there. When small cats turn up again in that country, they are a different animal entirely. The first of them was at a walled town out on the western road where the caravans came through. He had lived in the 8th century, and he was white, or white over most of him, with faint stripes on the rest. His mother's line is the line most cats in that country carry today. The nearest match to him is a cat from a town further west along the same road, alive at the same time. The town in the north in January is timber and thatch and a great deal of mud. It is dark by the middle of the afternoon, and it does not get light again until late morning. Smoke sits low over the roofs, and the lanes between the houses are churned up and frozen into ruts. Behind the workshops, the rubbish heaps rise a little higher. Every year, everything goes on to them, from kitchen scraps to shavings to the sweepings of the workshop floors. A heap like that holds rats through a winter that would kill them in an open field. The cats are on the roofs and under the floors and in the gaps between one building and the next. A town of that kind is built close, with lofts and cellars and thatch and stacked timber everywhere. For an animal that likes cover and dislikes open ground, the whole place is one long piece of cover. In the deep of winter, the doors stay shut and the shutters stay closed, and everyone lives in one room. The fire is banked and the animals are in the byre at the end of the house, and the smell of both is everywhere. A cat that gets itself indoors in that weather does considerably better than a cat that does not. Some of them managed it and slept by the hearth and were let alone. They were also worked. Cat fur was a trade in those centuries, with a supply behind it and workshops that took it in. The animals used for it were young ones. That sits there alongside the mice and the lofts and the winters, and both things are true. Bones from those towns went into boxes in a museum store and sat there for a great many years. A student was set the job of going through the boxes and pulling out every cat bone in them. It took a long time, and what she had at the end was a run of animals across the centuries. Each bone was measured at the same points, so the figures would line up from one age to the next. Then the old bones were set against cats that had lived within the last century or so. The cats got bigger as the centuries went on, gaining about a sixth between the Viking years and now. Almost nothing else that lives alongside people goes that way. A dog is about a quarter smaller than a wolf, and sheep and cattle and pigs all went down the same way. The cat went up instead, over the same centuries in which it stopped working and moved indoors by the fire. A street in a European town in the Middle Years is narrow and overhung and full of noise. There are stalls along one side and a gutter down the middle and cats on the sills and the low roofs. Somebody paints one of them into the corner of a picture, sitting by a fire or watching a bird. That cat has narrow stripes down its sides, the same stripes as the animal under the chair on the Nile. Every old picture agrees on this, right back to the beginning and across a great many places. The stripes run down off the spine and break into bands on the legs and rings on the tail. That is what a cat looked like for thousands of years, and everyone who painted one painted that. The wide swirled markings that most people picture when they think of a tabby are in none of it. That coat comes from one small change, and it is a quiet change that has to come from both parents before it shows. It is nowhere in the old ground at all. It appears first in the medieval centuries, away in the east, and it is rare when it appears. From there, it spreads, slowly at first, and then not slowly, and by the 1700s, it is common everywhere. 8 cats in 10 are carrying it now, which is a long way to travel for something nobody was breeding for. Ginger took longer still, and it was only pinned down a few years ago. A ginger coat rides on the X, and nearly all ginger cats are male. A tortoiseshell is patched for the same reason, and she is nearly always female. A female has a pair of those chromosomes. Early on in each cell, one of them switches off at random, and every cell that grows out of it keeps the same one shut. What nobody could find for the longest time was the actual piece of the animal that did it. It turned out to be a small stretch of missing material, a gap in a part that builds nothing itself. 2 groups on opposite sides of the world found it in the same season and published in the same week. The oldest thing anyone notices about a cat is its color, and the color was the last part to be worked out. There is a glass hall on a hill south of London, built for a great exhibition and then moved there piece by piece. It holds concerts and flower shows and crowds, and in the middle of July, it is very warm inside. On a Thursday in the summer of 1871, it held cats. The idea came from a man named Harrison Weir, who drew animals for the papers and for books. He had spent his life looking at animals closely enough to draw them, and he liked cats particularly. Dogs had shows and poultry had shows, and it seemed to him that cats might be looked at properly too. He took the notion to the manager of the hall, and the manager agreed to it. Finding the cats fell to the man who ran the natural history side of the building. He advertised in the papers and then had to talk owners into letting their animals out of the house for a couple of days. Nobody agrees on how many came in the end, and the counts given at the time do not match each other. The crowd came in numbers nobody had expected, and they came all day, and they filed past the cages in a slow line. Most of them had never looked at a cat as a thing to be looked at. The animals in the cages were not enjoying any of it, and the noise under that glass roof would have been considerable. It went on until the lights started to go, and then everybody went home. What was in the cages was a mixture of everything. There were Siamese which nobody in the country had seen in a cage before, and Manx cats with no tails. There were long-haired Persians, one of them out of the household of a dead prime minister. There was a Scottish wildcat, sent down by a duke, sitting among the house cats and not enjoying it. Weir had written out beforehand what a good cat of each sort should look like, feature by feature. That sheet of paper is where the whole business of pedigree cats starts, and an illustrator wrote it in a few days. He helped set up a club afterwards to run the shows and keep the registers, and he was its first president. He resigned from it after a while, saying the members had come to care more about winning than about cats. The wildcat in that cage was no curiosity from far away. Its own kind had been living in the woods of Europe the whole time the house cat was spreading through the villages. It is bigger and heavier, with a thick, blunt tail and a broader head, and it keeps well away from people. The two are close enough to have kittens together, and they had shared a continent for 2,000 years. For almost all of that time, they left each other alone. Looking back through the ground, the mixing between them stays under one part in 10, which is very little for animals this close. The reason was not in the animals. It was in where each of them stood. The house cat stayed where the food was, which meant the village and the farm and the town. The wild cat stayed in the woods and came out where the woods came out, and the two rarely met in the same month. Then in one country, the woods went. In Scotland, they were cut back, and the wild cats were hunted and trapped down to a few. Sickness went through what was left of them. A handful of animals scattered across a bare landscape will breed with whatever is nearby, because nothing else is nearby. Inside about 70 years, and well within living memory, the wild population there stopped being a wild population. A kitchen at 11 at night is warm and quiet with the light off and one lamp on in the next room. The floor is cool at the edges and warm in the middle where the pipes run underneath it. There is a bowl by the wall and a chair pulled out from the table and a bag of shopping still on the counter. The cat is asleep on the floor in the warm part on her side with her legs stretched out. Her ears turn once towards a sound in the wall and then settle back without her waking. She has narrow stripes down her flanks and rings on her tail, and her legs are long for her size. She weighs about what her great-grandmothers weighed out in the scrub. If the door were left open, she would go out and she would manage. She would hunt from the first week and take a patch of ground and hold it against other cats. She would raise kittens, and those kittens would raise kittens, and in a few years, there would be a colony living out there. Nothing would need teaching, because nothing was ever taken away from her. The eyes are the eyes of the animal under the thorn bush, made for the hour after sunset. The ears are the same ears, turning one at a time towards a sound too high for anyone in the house to hear. And the gut still handles meat and nothing else. The nose gives up a good deal of ordinary smell in exchange for reading what other cats have left on the gatepost. Somewhere along the way, her family stopped minding the noise, and that is the whole of what changed in her. Everything else about her walked in out of the dry country and never got put down. She is lying on a warm floor in a town, and she is the same animal that was lying under the thorn bush. The village on the Millet plain is farmland again, and the pits and the post holes are back under the crop. The jars from it survive as pieces rather than as jars. The cat bones are in a drawer with a number on them, and more than one person has taken them out and measured them since. The spotted cats are still in that country, living in forest and scrub across a wide band of it. They are not tame, and they never quite were. They have not gone into a village on purpose for a very long time, and they get along without doing so. The person in the grave on the island was lifted, recorded, and taken to a store with the shells and the axes. The cat that lay beside them was lifted separately, one bone at a time, and drawn and photographed many times since. The grave is closed now and written up, and nothing further has come out of it. Jean-Denis Vigne carried on working for many years after that, on the bones of the earliest cats. The grave stands in his record, and so does the short paper about the jawbones. They sit one under the other in the same lists, the find and the correction, which is the ordinary shape of the work. The passages in the cliff are still cut into the rock and still hold what was left in them. Some of the bundles have been through hospital scanners with the wrappings left on. The bronze masks and the little wooden boxes are in cases in museums in a good many countries. The cats that went from the river to Liverpool were ground down and spread on fields in the northwest of England. Those fields are still fields, or they are streets now, and there is no getting any of it back. The handful of bundles kept out of the sale are in the museum there, and they are what survives. Gaston Maspero's argument was made in the year of the sale and ignored in the year of the sale. It became the ordinary view about a century afterwards. Once there were ways of getting something out of the material. The wild cats carried out to Sardinia are still there in the hills, and they are still wild. They came from Africa, and somebody put them ashore, and their descendants have had the island ever since. They are not house cats gone feral, and never were, and they keep away from people as their own kind always did. The toothless male out on the flat land is nearly complete, and he has been scanned and sampled and written up. The town he lived in was abandoned long ago and is a low mound on level ground. The people who fed him left no account of doing it, and the whole record of it is in his bones. The white cat from the walled town on the western road is part of a skeleton in a collection. His mother's line is carried now by most of the cats in that country, and the road he came along is still in use. The two cats from the wreck are in a laboratory near the bay with the barrel staves and the ballast stones that came up with them. The ship stayed on the bottom for centuries until instruments that read the seabed for iron found them lying there. The Danish bones went back into their boxes in the museum store when the measuring was finished. The measurements are the part that lasts, because anyone can go and take the same ones on more bones. The boxes are still on the shelves, labeled in the order they were put back in. The swirled coat is the ordinary coat now, and most cats alive are carrying it. The striped coat that came out of Africa is still underneath it, and it shows whenever the swirl is not doubled up. Half the cats on any street are wearing the older pattern without anybody noticing that it is older. The gap behind ginger is in every ginger cat and every tortoiseshell and every calico in the world. It was described twice in the same week by people who had never spoken to each other, and the two descriptions agree. The glass hall on the hill burned down within living memory of the show, and the hill has a park on it now. The terraces are still there under the grass, and so are the steps, and people walk dogs up and down them. Harrison Weir's sheet of paper was rewritten and rewritten until nothing of the wording is left. What he set up around it, of classes and registers and judges working to a written standard, is still exactly how it is done. What he actually wanted, which was for people to think better of the ordinary cat by the fire, did not survive it. The Wildcat of Europe is still in Germany, and in Portugal, and in Spain, and across parts of the East, in small numbers. In Scotland, the population, as it stood, is gone, mixed away inside a single lifetime. Animals raised in captivity have been let out into the hills there in recent years, and nobody yet knows how that goes. The striped cat is still out in the dry country, along the north of Africa, and across Western Asia. She is doing tonight what she was doing before there were villages in more or less the same places. The main thing pressing on her now is breeding with the animals that went into the villages and came back out again. The cat on the kitchen floor is on every continent people live on. In numbers nobody has counted. She eats meat. She wakes at dusk, and she could go out of the door tomorrow and manage. She has been in the house for a while now, and she has not put anything down on her way in. There is nothing here that needs doing, though a few small things are sitting there if you want them. A like is a quiet signal that carries this to somebody else who is lying awake tonight. The comment box is open, and the season outside your window is the only thing worth putting in it. Deep winter, or the first warm week, or the long dry end of summer, or the rains. Subscribing means the next of these will find you without your having to look for it. A membership option sits below that for anyone who wants to support the work directly. None of that matters, and staying here until you fall asleep is the whole of it. The room is still there, or rooms very much like it are, in a great many places. The walls are thick, and the roof is low, and the floor is bare earth, packed hard by walking. The jars stand along one side, as high as a shoulder, gray with dust, with grain in them from the harvest. The doorway lets in one band of light that lies across the floor and stops short of the corners. The air is dry and cool and smells of dust and a little of the grain itself. Outside, the fields start, where the last house ends, and the ground between them is bare and flat. Behind the last jar, there is still the gap between the wall and the floor, 2 fingers wide. Something small goes across the band of light towards it and is gone before the shape of it registers. Further back, out of the light, another animal is sitting with its feet folded under it, not waiting for anything. The light in the doorway moves a hand's width across the floor, and the dust in it turns over slowly. The jars stand where they were left, and the grain inside them settles, and the room stays cool until the middle of the morning.